Hi there. My name is Matthew Thompson, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto in the Cinema Studies Institute. And this is a paper entitled Silent Running and the Metaphor of Spaceship Earth. I'm recording this talk near Parry Sound, Ontario. In 1966, Buckminster Fuller wrote, quote, "I've often heard people say, I wonder what it would be like to be on board a spaceship." He continues, "The answer is very simple. What does it feel like? That's all we have ever experienced. We are all astronauts." End quote. With this assertion, Fuller reorients the reader, substituting for the seemingly limitless world of finite technological means of transportation. Fuller goes on, quote, "I know you are paying attention, but I'm sure you don't immediately agree and say, yes, that's right, I am an astronaut. I'm sure that you don't really sense yourselves to be aboard a fantastically real spaceship, our spherical spaceship Earth." End quote. With this reconceptualization of the planet as a spaceship, Fuller swings our perspective from its accustomed position, fixed upon the stable, eternal Earth looking outwards, to a new, groundless vantage looking back upon ourselves from a great height. Within this perspective shift, a number of substitutions take place. The limitless is replaced by the finite, nature by technology, world by system. Thinking of the Earth as a spaceship is a rhetorical move that became increasingly popular during the space age in North America. Spaceship Earth eventually became one of the most important symbols of the modern environmental movement of the 1970s. This paper seeks to ask the question, how does the metaphor of Spaceship Earth function as a rhetorical figure in politics and popular culture? In order to address this question, I will use as a case study the environmental science fiction film from 1972, Silent Running. Silent Running takes place on board the spaceship Valley Forge, which is stationed near Saturn. The Valley Forge houses and preserves multiple ecosystems that can no longer survive on Earth. These ecosystems are tended to by Freeman Lowell, played by Bruce Dern, who, along with 3 others, make up the entire human crew of this massive ship. Dern plays a spaced-out hippie with long hair and patches sewn onto his astronaut jumpsuit. He rails against his fellow crew members for tearing up his garden with their four-wheelers, for eating synthetic food and eschewing the food he himself grows, and ultimately for not caring that the ship carries the last of Earth's biodiversity. Lowell's exasperation with his apathetic crew mirrors the despair felt by environmentalists then and now. The domes that house the various ecosystems are a prime example of how Silent Running participates in an environmental discourse popular during the 1970s. Composed of interlocking metal frame triangles with a transparent skin stretched across their hemispherical shape, the architecture of the ecosystems aboard the Valley Forge is based on Buckminster Fuller's geodesic domes. Initially popularized by Fuller in 1954, the geodesic dome is a model for efficiency and sustainability because it encloses the largest volume with the least amount of building material. Geodesic domes are also thermally efficient and structurally very strong. In the 1960s, Fuller was asked to design the United States Pavilion for the World Exposition in Montreal. Fuller proposed an ambitious project, a dome 250 feet wide by 200 feet tall. The dome was to be encased in a translucent acrylic shell. The structure would also be equipped with automatic blinds that functioned like moving clouds, controlling the amount of sunlight and solar heat gain. Fuller imagined that the acrylic shell could be designed to function like human skin, with different cells designed to be light-sensitive, reactive to heat, or porous to oxygen. Inspired by the self-regulating systems of the human body and the planet, Fuller imagined an architecture that utilized cybernetic feedback systems and space-age technology in order to more closely mimic the natural world. Through intelligent design, Fuller hoped to marry modern technology with the logic of the organic. Jonathan Massey observes that, quote, "The pavilion was a figure of Spaceship Earth," end quote. The Expo 67 dome was to model a utopian ideal whereby humanity recognized the planet as a closed system and therefore attempted to marshal its limited resources through conservation and cultivation. Silent Running changes Fuller's vision from utopian to dystopian. The Valley Forge, with its geodesic domes containing otherwise extinct ecosystems, takes the metaphor of Spaceship Earth and visualizes, or rather, revisualizes it. The metaphor of the Earth as a spaceship owes its popularity to the photographs of the Earth from space brought back from the Apollo missions. It is a profoundly visual metaphor. And yet, when it is translated back into images in Silent Running, the rhetorical figure of Spaceship Earth is distorted and condensed, such that cracks in its ecological utopian shell begin to appear. The power of the Spaceship Earth metaphor comes from the suggestion that the Earth is in fact a small, closed system within a black void. A spaceship is a tightly controlled life support system with just enough resources aboard to ensure survival for the duration of the mission. Any long-term stay on a spaceship requires strict regimes of conservation, recycling, and cultivation. The Spaceship Earth metaphor is a hybrid of ecological and technological discourses. As Sabine Hohler states in her book, Spaceship Earth in the Environmental Age, quote, "Spaceship Earth needs to be seen as a veritable cyborg metaphor," end quote. It collapses the distinction between the environment and human technology. Spaceship Earth acknowledges that technology and non-human nature coexist within the same environment, so integrated that it has always been hard to say where nature ends and culture begins. Some articulations of the figure eschew this confusion, however, in order to emphasize technology's ecologically redemptive potential. The revisualization of the metaphor of Spaceship Earth in the form of the Valley Forge encloses the remnants of the biosphere within the walls of an actual spaceship. While Fuller's cybernetic dome was modeled after and existed within the environment, the Valley Forge redesigns the environment so that it is compatible with and contained inside spaceship technology. Instead of a porous membrane designed after skin, the domes of the Valley Forge are encased in a plastic shell that must withstand the vacuum of space. As a textual metaphor, Spaceship Earth contains both displaced and substituted signifiers simultaneously, not only in the mind, but also on the page. In this way, it is possible to change which signifier is the substitute and which is the displaced. In the case of Fuller's autonomic dome, the base signifier of the Earth is overlaid with the idea of a spaceship. On the Valley Forge, the Earth is no longer the grounding signifier, a referent that is being poetically enhanced by comparison with the spaceship. The Earth becomes instead a substitute, the idea that is draped over the reality of the ship. The metaphor is reversed. Instead of technology within the environment is contained within technology. This is how Silent Running transforms Spaceship Earth from a utopian ideal into a dystopian future. In so doing, the film reveals the desire to contain and control the environment inherent in all articulations of the metaphor. It is possible to locate the Spaceship Earth metaphor in a genealogy of rhetorical figures used to describe our relationship with non-human nature dating back to the scientific revolution. Doing so demonstrates that while Spaceship Earth is deeply indebted to its space-age moment for its imagery, its mechanistic worldview is much older. Environmental historian Carolyn Merchant has traced the long history of how rhetorical relationships to the environment have changed as we have become more efficient at exploiting it. In her book, The Death of Nature, Women, Ecology, and the Scientific Revolution, she argues that a significant transition in how people wrote about the natural world occurred during the Enlightenment. Prior to the so-called Age of Reason, Europeans thought of themselves as functioning elements of an organic whole. This way of thinking, which often imagined the world as a macro-scale organism analogically related to our own bodies, influenced the ways that humans interacted with their environment. Merchant argues that in places where this organic metaphor shaped thinking about both nature and politics, ecological balance was achieved. The ecological harmony that resulted when humans viewed themselves not as separate from nature, but as an integral part of it, was disrupted with the scientific revolution. Merchant describes the transition from organic to mechanical metaphors that took place during the Enlightenment. Quote, "The primacy of organic process gave way to the stability of mathematical laws and identities. Matter was corpuscular, passive, and inert. Change was simply the rearrangement of particles as motion was transmitted from one part to another. Because it viewed nature as dead and matter as passive, mechanism could function as a subtle sanction for the exploitation and manipulation of nature and its resources." End quote. Non-human nature was transformed by scientific rationality into inert matter and the forces that acted upon it. Even animals were thought of as machines by influential thinkers of the period like Descartes. As humans utilized scientific rationality to develop new and more complex machine technologies, which in turn facilitated increased control over and extraction from non-human nature, the analogy between machine and environment became more entrenched. In the 1960s and 70s, this machine metaphor reached its apotheosis with the figuration of Spaceship Earth. Thinking of the Earth as a spaceship substitutes for the natural world one of the most sophisticated collections of integrated machine technology. The metaphorical substitution of spaceship for planet mirrors the process by which human astronauts transcended their home environment. By launching people into space, we have finally, if temporarily, affected the separation of human from biological nature that has been our goal since the time of the scientific revolution. By equating the complex and integrated system of the biosphere with a human-designed machine, the myth of the human's ability to understand and control the natural world is perpetuated once more. Ironically, Spaceship Earth, a continuation of the machine metaphor that Merchant holds responsible for much ecological degradation, was championed by environmentalists. Planetary metaphors contain a vast potential for divergent significations. We cannot say that all environmentalists who adopted Spaceship Earth were duped into perpetuating the machine metaphor. Sabine Hohler argues that the metaphor of Spaceship Earth owes its popularity to its balancing of seemingly opposite worldviews. She points out that, quote, Spaceship Earth represented crisis and progress at once, enabling environmentalists and technocrats, doomsayers and technological optimists to argue seemingly opposite positions in the same terms, end quote. The polysemy of Spaceship Earth can be attributed in part to its condensation of the organic and the mechanical. This condensation reflects the necessarily integrated relationship between human technology and non-human nature. The issue with the Spaceship Earth metaphor is not that it combines the machine and the organic. Rather, the problem lies in the hubristic connotation that the organic can be replicated and controlled by technology. In Silent Running, this is precisely what happens. Non-human nature is subsumed, enclosed, and ultimately replaced by the spaceship. An infertile mechanical planet, apart from the humans that populate it, is the narrative backdrop for the events that take place in Silent Running. A homogeneous climate has rendered Earth inhospitable for complex ecosystems, which are no longer necessary as human needs can be met synthetically. Thus, Freeman Lowell protects the ecosystems aboard the Valley Forge not for the salvation of humankind, which is apparently doing quite well, but for other reasons. Lowell articulates one reason for his passionate guardianship of the space forests early in the film. One evening, the Valley Forge receives news that due to a lack of funding, the ecosystems must be jettisoned and destroyed. The following morning, the rest of the crew begins preparations to release and then detonate the biodomes with little to no remorse. While eating breakfast with his crewmates, Lowell engages in a heated argument with his smug comrades. He laments the state of the Earth and human society, exclaiming at one point, quote, "There is no more beauty, there is no more imagination, and there are no more frontiers left to conquer," end quote. Lowell's tirade lays bare the ideological framework of the film's environmentalism. If non-human nature is no longer necessary for survival, it is still desperately needed for the maintenance of the myth of the individual cultivated by colonialism, capitalism, and the American pastoral. During the same outburst, Lowell points to a photograph of a young white girl stuck to the wall. Lowell demands, quote, "Look on the wall behind you. Look at that little girl's face. I know you've seen it. But do you know what she's never going to be able to see? She's never going to be able to see the simple wonder of a leaf in her hand because there's not going to be any trees," end quote. This is a classic example of another popular 1970s environmental image. According to Finnis Dunaway, quote, "The vulnerable child, usually and not coincidentally a white child, became a key visual motif to project a sense of universal vulnerability. This equation of whiteness with universal danger has made environmental problems appear to transcend race and class divisions. Although the poor and racial minorities have often been exposed to higher levels of pollutants and toxicity, media images have repeatedly imagined the citizenry as being equally vulnerable to environmental risk," end quote. Lowell mobilizes the image of the innocent white child on the day of the destruction of the last Earth ecosystems in order to convey the magnitude of the mistake his crew members are making. Lowell's arguments fall on deaf ears, however, and the other three begin the process of blasting the last of Earth's biodiversity into space. Lowell retreats to his garden in one of the domes while the other forests are destroyed. When one crew member comes to prepare Lowell's dome for release, he reacts violently. Lowell kills his three crewmates in order to save the last remaining ecosystem and hijacks the space freighter. Lowell sets the Valley Forge on a course past Saturn and into deep space. Here the tone of the film transitions from a militant environmentalism towards a meditation on isolation in deep space. After the sudden and violent loss of his human companions, Lowell begins to realize the vast solitude of space. Loneliness motivates him to rename and reprogram the ship's 3 artificially intelligent maintenance drones. Lowell teaches the drones how to perform medical operations, play poker, and eventually how to garden. Despite their faceless appearance, the drones manage to convey an emotional subtlety that, arguably, outperforms Bruce Dern's wide-eyed fanatic. That the drones appear as living machines is thanks to the fact that they are controlled by actors. Dewey, Huey, and Louie are played collectively by Mark Persons, Stephen Brown, Cheryl Sparks, and Larry Weisenhunt. The four actors, who were all bilateral amputees, managed, despite the cumbersome, boxy costumes and intense physical effort, to lend the drones an emotional intelligence in addition to their AI. The drones are a mirror reflection of the biodomes, both biological systems contained within machine enclosures. The biodomes and the drones function as two ends of a cyborg spectrum. Like the spaceship Earth metaphor, they conflate the organic with the mechanical, while simultaneously showing that machine technology and the natural world are inextricably linked. The Valley Forge, its forest domes, and its drones share with Spaceship Earth a discursive tendency to try and contain organisms and their environments within mechanical apparatuses. The cinema also participates in this narrative of domination through containment and control. It does this, both generally and in the case of Silent Running, in a twofold manner. First, the pro-filmic environment is typically strictly controlled by the filmmaker, and often contained within a studio architecture. Second, this pro-filmic environment is captured with a mechanism that translates it, whether through a chemical or digital process, into a condensed two-dimensional world which is later reanimated in the equally controlled and contained space of the movie theater. The biodomes on the Valley Forge share with the history of the cinema a common goal. Both seek to enclose environments within tightly controlled, human-built spaces in order to ensure their future reproduction. Restricted by a tight budget, the crew had to find unconventional spaces in which to construct the interiors of the Valley Forge. Building spaceship interiors from scratch was too costly, so the production looked for a pre-existing structure they could modify. They located a retired aircraft carrier which had just returned from the Vietnam War. The Valley Forge, from which the spaceship takes its name, was available to rent for just $2,000 a week. The spaces below decks required little modification in order to become the control rooms and living quarters aboard the Valley Forge's fictional counterpart. Wayne Smith, one of the visual effects team, explains that they had to, quote, find ways to use the same shapes for set construction and dressing when at all feasible, end quote. The marshalling of scarce resources characterized not only the narrative of the Valley Forge, but the conditions of its production as well. Silent Running's production history involves an even more drastic form of environmental control, one much more antithetical to its environmentalist message than the technophilia of the Spaceship Earth metaphor. As Smith explains in his article for American Cinematographer, the corporate giant Dow Chemical provided much of the plastic, rubber, and epoxy resin involved in the set design. Along with $60,000, this in-kind support was given in return for brand placement within the film and a line in the credits. Multiple times throughout the film, the Dow logo is displayed on storage containers in the ship's hold, and the company is given most sincere thanks at the end of the film. This is surprising for a film drawing upon the countercultural and environmental politics of its moment, as Dow was involved in at least 3 high-profile environmental scandals leading up to and during the film's production. Dow Chemical manufactured and sold DDT, napalm, and Agent Orange for use both domestically and abroad in the Vietnam War. The domestic use of DDT was banned by the Nixon administration in 1972, following Rachel Carson's scathing attack on the insecticide in Silent Spring. By 1966, the use of napalm as an incendiary chemical weapon in Vietnam was so unpopular with the American public that every manufacturer had ceased production except Dow. Dow was also involved in supplying the American military with the defoliant Agent Orange, despite internal research indicating the possibility of harmful effects as early as 1964. During the production of Silent Running, Dow was involved in legal action to overturn a ban on the domestic use of Agent Orange that was issued after a 3-fold increase of miscarriage was associated with the herbicide. Dow continued to produce Agent Orange and claimed that it was safe throughout the 1970s. We now know that it has had devastating effects, including links to cancer, miscarriage, and congenital disabilities, both in Vietnam and the United States. Whether by killing insects, burning jungle, or defoliating trees, these chemicals are some of the most extreme methods by which humans seek to bend the environment to their will. While no explanation is given in Silent Running as to why non-human nature has collapsed on Earth, it very well could be the result of chemicals like the ones produced by Dow. Near the end of Silent Running, the Valley Forge is rediscovered by a search party. Suffering from deep space isolation, Lowell has reverted to eating synthetic food and has let his quarters become cluttered and filthy. It takes the shock of his discovery by the search party for Lowell to realize that the ecosystem is dying from a lack of sunlight. His path away from the center of the solar system has deprived the miniature spaceship Earth of its source of photosynthetic energy. Lowell has an ecological crisis on his hands, and he needs technology to solve it. Recognizing that when the searchers reach the ship, the ecosystem will be terminated and he will be arrested for murder, Lowell decides to take his own life by destroying the ship. Before carrying out his self-destruction, however, Lowell takes pains to ensure that the ecosystem will continue to survive in his absence. Having taught the drone Dewey how to maintain the forest, Lowell installs hydroponic lights to make up for the lack of sun, and jettisons Dewey with the biodome. He creates a non-human utopian island in deep space. The biodome becomes a self-sustaining, cybernetic cyborg system. The mirrored metaphors of Spaceship Earth and Living Machine are combined in a feedback loop. The ecosystem is both enclosed and controlled by mechanical systems. It is a machine within a garden within a machine. When the human is removed from the equation, this overdetermined biological system becomes unexpectedly hopeful. Earlier in the film, Lowell seems to think that the Earth's forest should be saved so that young white children, who stand in ideologically for universal humanity, can enjoy the pastoral inspiration with which the United States was constructed. His final act of sending the biodome off into space to continue its non-human feedback cycle, however, shows that Lowell values the right of non-human entities to exist for themselves. The last biodome, removed from the human context, becomes a place where the differences between non-human machine and non-human nature collapse, an integrated, self-sustaining system that demonstrates the ecological equilibrium that for humans seems so impossible. The last biodome shows that when the difference between nature and culture, machine and organism breaks down, it becomes easier to imagine sustainability. Without human consciousness aboard the self-sustaining dome, the machine and the organic elements of the environment reintegrate. There is no longer a metaphorical distance between Dewey, the dome, and the forest. Dewey, the living machine, can stand in for the biodome, and vice versa. This non-human spaceship Earth is a representation of our own totally integrated environment on Earth. As residents of Earth, we are not astronauts piloting a spaceship, as Fuller would have us believe. We are instead, like Dewey's biodome, cybernetic systems engaged in a feedback cycle with our vessel. Thank you very much.